Okay, we are live now. And the video is working and the microphone's on, so I think we're all set. All right, well, last week we studied Genesis chapter 9, the last 10 verses, or verses 18 to 29. And they remind us about Noah's sons. And here's the first verse. Now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. So this is a summary of what's coming up to explain. And the birth order is not the correct order. We think that Japheth was the oldest, Shem was the second, and Ham was the youngest. They and their wives came with Noah on the ark, so there were exactly 8 people aboard the vessel. There were no grandkids in the ark born yet. It appears that grandchildren started being born about 2 years after they left the ark from Mount Ararat. And now verses 20 to 23. And Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard. Then he drank of the wine and was drunk, and became uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his 2 brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on their shoulders, and went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. Now, we know that this did not happen immediately after the flood, because it takes at least 3 years to grow a vineyard with grapes ready to drink. Also, Ham's oldest son Canaan is already old enough, apparently, to make fun of his grandfather Noah here. So I would guess that this event occurred maybe 10 or 15 years after the flood. It's also interesting that it says Noah began to be a farmer. This implies that perhaps he was never a farmer before the flood. We don't know what he did. Maybe he was an engineer, or maybe he raised animals. But at any rate, now he becomes a farmer. And the reason is because even though God now has given people permission to eat animals, wild animals are running away and spreading over the earth. So you're not going to catch many of those. And even if you have domestic animals, you can't eat a whole lot of them before you run out. So it takes a while for them to give birth and be ready to eat. So they need to grow grains and fruits and vegetables, because all they had was what they had stored in the ark. So we guess that it took many years to plant these things and start growing them again. So he and his sons need to get cracking at growing food that can produce seeds and be replanted everywhere. The earth is now fertile. It's no longer cursed, the soil. So things are growing good again. And yet we're told that one of the things Noah apparently loved best was his vineyard. And not only did he produce grapes, he made wine and got drunk. Now, there is very excellent scientific and archaeological evidence that Armenia is the place where wine growing started. We find the oldest wine areas, and then I'm trying to remember what they call all the tools. And it's not a well. What is it where you squish the grapes? Does it have a name? Vats. They find ancient vats where people used to squish the grapes. So, and coincidentally, Armenia is where the ark landed on Mount Ararat. So it makes sense that Noah moved to a place nearby, Mount Ararat. And even though the Bible doesn't give any rebuke about Noah's drunkenness, throughout the Bible, we do see that drunkenness is opposed. You're not supposed to get drunk. There's nothing wrong with booze per se, and the Bible even talks many times about how having a little wine makes your heart merry. That's okay, but he got a little out of control here, and somehow he got naked in the process of being drunk. And this led to some major family dispute. What probably happened is that when Noah got drunk and naked, Ham saw his naked father, and he called over his oldest son Canaan, and they had some real laughs about their foolish father or grandfather. Or it's possible also that Canaan saw Noah drunk and went and told his dad Ham, and Ham went and saw it, and then they were trying to spread the word to everybody, hey, come look at silly Noah, he's drunk and naked. But instead, the other sons, Seth and Shem and Japheth, covered him up. So we looked at a number of Bible texts in the Bible that show how nakedness is viewed. And obviously, there's nothing wicked in itself about nakedness. What's wrong is when you see people who are not your wife or husband naked. You're not supposed to do that. In fact, in Leviticus, it's in the list of sins. Seeing your father or your mother's nakedness is in the same list of sins as committing adultery and worshiping idols. And they're all punishable by death because they're all an abomination in the sight of God. So making fun of the nakedness of your parents when they're incapacitated is a pretty big sin. My theory is that all of those sins show lack of authority. You're worshiping the wrong God. You are not exercising proper authority over yourself, and you're exercising authority over people whom you have no business trying to do so. Kids do not exercise authority over their parents, and the lovers do not exercise authority over their lovers' spouses or families, so they're all failing to execute authority. But I also showed you that this occurs strangely in Romans 8:35 as one of the sins that cannot separate us from the love of Jesus. Romans 8:35. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Now you think of all the things in that verse, the one that you take out would be nakedness. What's the big deal about nakedness? Well, it's not because God cares whether you're naked or not. It's referring to shame. Not even your own shame can endanger your own soul when you're loved by Christ. So even your own shame is discarded by Jesus. So the point is that seeing nakedness inappropriately is a wicked thing. And laughing about a wicked thing is even worse, which also has something to say about comedy these days, doesn't it? It's one thing to joke about evil, but then to revel and mock evil is even worse. So now Genesis 9, verses 24 and 25. So Noah awoke from his wine, and he knew what his younger son had done to him. Then he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren." So Noah, he's maybe about 615 years old. He wakes up, he sobers up, and he learns what Ham and Canaan had done. And a lot of people are confused about why did Noah curse Canaan when it says Ham is the one who made fun of his nakedness. Well, we have to believe that Canaan was involved, obviously. But also, he cursed Canaan because in Genesis 9:1, God blessed Noah and his sons. So he blessed Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So it doesn't really work well for you to curse somebody after God blessed them. That doesn't work. Remember, Balaam goes through that whole thing. I can't curse these people. God's blessed them. So instead, he has to curse somebody else, and someone else who was involved was apparently Canaan, the son of Ham. So that's why Noah cursed Canaan. So we talked the rest of the week, last week, about Ham. Ham, his name means hot or sunburned. It has a couple different meanings in Hebrew. And we looked at the children of Ham as shown in Genesis chapter 10, which we will continue to do today, called the Table of Nations. We'll talk a lot about Genesis 10 today. And then today we will be looking at the older brother Japheth and his sons from that text. But Ham, he was the youngest son. We talked about him first because he gets cursed. And so we talked about the curse. Ham's sons were 4: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Now the descendants of Ham controlled Lebanon, Syria, Canaan, and most of Africa, including Ethiopia, Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, etc., etc. It's possible, and the Hamites obviously loved hot countries. Everywhere they lived were places that are pretty hot. And that makes sense because Ham's name means hot. They love the warmth. I guess maybe the ladies would like to live there. Huh? You guys like to be warm all the time. It is possible that the two famous Egyptian gods, Horus and Seth, represent Ham and Shem. There's a number of reasons for believing that, just archaeologically. And it shows that Ham ruled Africa and Shem ruled Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Now, Cush, a son of Ham, means black, and he settled in Ethiopia, south of Egypt. And it's interesting that Moses' first wife, Zipporah, was a Midianite, and Moses' second wife was a Cushite. Now, the Midianites are believed to be also from the Cush tribe and were largely black or dark-skinned. So it's possible that both of Moses' wives, including Zipporah, were black or dark complexioned. Psalm 68:31 prophesies, "Envoys will come out of Egypt. Ethiopia will quickly stretch out her hands to God." So we talked about some of the things this could mean. This could refer to the Queen of Sheba who came to visit Solomon and learned about God from him. Or it could refer to the book of Acts when Philip baptized the Ethiopian eunuch. But I believe that this prophecy really refers to the farther future, starting in about the 4th century AD, when a missionary went there and the entire country converted and formed the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And that has been the majority religion in that country for 1,700 years. It's still the majority. They estimate that about 60% of Ethiopians today are Christian, at least in name, and about 30% are Muslim. So the Cushites or Ethiopians may be the most Christian nation in Africa. So Psalm 68:31 may be a prophecy of that change. So that was Cush. Cush went to Ethiopia. Mizraim, a son of Ham, he became the guy who ruled Egypt. And Mizraim actually means two muddy lands. And that refers to Upper and Lower Egypt. Oh, two muddy red lands. So it's iron-rich mud, and that's because the Nile spreads the water from from southern Egypt to northern Egypt. But southern Egypt is the high spot. That's the mountains, and it goes downhill to the north. The Nile travels north. But Mizraim is how the Bible refers to Egypt throughout. The word Egypt actually comes from Greek and Latin, and that's Aegyptus. But before that, Hebrews called it Mizraim, the land of Mizraim. And so Joseph and Jacob, you remember Joseph was sold into slavery and became the prime minister of Egypt, and he invited his family, his father Jacob, and all of his brothers to come live there during the famine, because only Egypt had food at the time. That's how the Jews ended up being in Egypt, in the land of Mizraim. But it says that soon the Egyptians forgot Joseph and enslaved the Jews. So one of the sons of Mizraim was named Philistia, and he moved north along the coast and formed a country called Philistia, the Philistines. So another son of Ham was the Philistines. They became a real thorn in the side of the Jews of Canaan. And another son of Ham was named Put, and Put means bow. And it's interesting, it's the same word that's used for rainbow. However, he moved to Libya and formed the tribes of North Africa, and they became famous archers, so he lived up to his name. It's an interesting question as to whether in the Bible these guys got their names later based on the way they were, or whether God gave them names and they're prophetic names because they end up fulfilling those names. I find that an intriguing question. And you'll see what I mean when we talk more about Japheth later. But the most famous son of Ham is Canaan. And that's because his people stayed around in the land of Israel, or Canaan. Canaan's first son, Sidon, formed the famous city near Tyre around Lebanon, to the north of Israel. Canaan's second son became the ruler of the Hittites in Syria, to the north of Lebanon. According to the Jewish Book of Jubilees, which is an ancient book, it's not in the Bible, Canaan was told that he should move far west and settle in modern Spain or in northwest Africa, where Casablanca, Morocco are. But he supposedly refused and says, I'm staying right here. And that became a problem because when Shem comes along, he's going to drive them out, all the Canaanites, kill most of them. So now let's look at Noah's curse. It's Genesis 9:25-27. Then Noah said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. So Noah, after this wine incident, blesses Shem and Japheth, but curses Canaan to be a servant to Shem and Japheth. And this is a way that God identifies the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. In other words, the seed of the serpent are the children of Satan, the disobedient ones. And these children of Ham who remain in Judea will be enslaved and destroyed within a few hundred years. And this is not just because of the curse, because children are not responsible for the sins of their fathers. It's because the Canaanites would be immensely wicked. And after centuries of God's patience, God tells Joshua, go in and destroy them. So that's why. Now, as I said, I no longer believe that the curse on Canaan should continue today. I believe that with the coming of Christ and the end of Judea as a national people of God, now the church is the people of God, and tribal affiliations mean nothing. There are no ancient blessings that should be affecting modern tribes, and there are no ancient curses that should be held against modern tribes. So it doesn't matter now if you come from the children of Shem or the children of Japheth or the children of Ham. The table of nations in Genesis 10 is great for helping us understand history, but the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent are no longer represented by tribes. In other words, there is no tribe of Israel that is the people of God. Now the church is the people of God, and the church is made up of people from all tribes, tongues, peoples, and nations. So the curses are gone. Now you're only cursed if you're a children of the devil. And also I mentioned again that there is no sign that the curse of Canaan was a curse to make them black people. This is a modern racist idea meant to demean them. So last verse we studied last week was Genesis 9, 28 and 29. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. I pointed out that Noah was a flawed man, just like all of us, and yet he was also righteous and loved by God. So today, we'll start Genesis chapter 10, which is called the Table of Nations. Now, this piece of the Bible is very boring to read. It's kind of like reading a begat and begat and begat. However, it is actually one of the most important pieces of the Bible. And the reason is that it is evidence of the truth of the Bible and Genesis, because it also matches very closely to other modern genealogies. I'm going to turn the camera here a little. There we go. It also explains where all of our nations and cultures and tribes came from. Now, its main purpose was probably to show that the line of Shem is the line of the woman, and the Messiah will come from the line of Shem. However, it incidentally, and good for us, shows where all the nations came from. In fact, there are so many ancient genealogies that confirm this genealogy that it's really ridiculous. And atheists and skeptics have to do cartwheels to try to explain them away. One of them, the most famous one, is from the 8th century AD. So that's about 750 AD. In Wales, which is in England, a monk named Nennius. He had a genealogy that went from the Anglo-Saxons of his time backward all the way to Noah. And it matches almost exactly to the line we see. Of course, the line we see in Genesis 10 doesn't go that far forward, but it confirms all these things. And here's another one that's hard to explain, the Chinese. The Chinese have ancient references to Noah and his 3 sons who were named Lo-Han, Lo-Shen, and Lo-Japhu. That's pretty obviously Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, the skeptics try to say, well, it must be modern corruptions that somehow slipped into the ancient manuscripts. But it's pretty hard to disprove that these manuscripts are 2,000 years old. So how did a modern missionary slip them in? So, another purpose for this table of nations in Genesis 10 is to show how God's blessing and purpose for his people was accomplished. You remember he blessed them and told them to be fruitful and multiply and spread out over the earth. Now, he did not want them, God did not want everyone crowded all into one little country. But they will attempt to do that in the story of Babel, and we'll come to that in a few weeks. God tends to get what he wants even when humans try to ignore his plans. So Genesis 10 shows how God spread them out even if they didn't want to. Now, you should also notice that the liberals who believe in an old earth and millions of years of evolution, they either take this chapter as a myth or as a general outline and not real history. So they would say that instead of Ham bearing Canaan and Mizraim, there were many generations in between. So they're just mentioning Ham, and then maybe 6 generations later there was a Canaan. And then 20 generations later there was Sidon. That's how they try to stretch us to fit in the hundreds of thousands of human evolutionary years. But there's no reason to believe that. It's just foolishness, in my opinion. So Genesis 10:1 is the introduction to the section. Now, this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And sons were born to them after the flood. So that's just a summary of what's coming up. Now we'll read verses 2 through 5, and this is where we'll be for the rest of the day. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan were Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these, the coastland people of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. Now you can see there, where it mentions everyone according to his language, that this is referring later to the Tower of Babel, because everybody's languages gets changed after the Tower of Babel. Now Japheth's name means expansion or enlargement. And that's exactly what his children will do in obedience to God's command, at least after the Tower of Babel. Now, they may not do it willingly, but they will spread across the earth. In fact, it's quite likely that most of us in this room are probably from Japheth's line, because Japheth's line spread into all the northern lands, taking over Europe, Russia, Siberia, and even eventually moving into North and possibly South America. So most Americans are probably from the line of Japheth. However, there's also a chance that we're from the children of Ham, because a couple tribes of Ham came. We'll talk about that later too. So you wonder, Japheth's name is enlarged. And did he get his name because he obeyed God and spread? Or did his name just mean a prophecy and God knew he was going to spread? That's an interesting question. Now, one of the Greek names, you'll be surprised how common and important Japheth was. You didn't even know it. One of the Greek names for Japheth was Iapetus, who is even named in Homer's book, the Iliad. If you've ever read the Iliad, he's in there. He was called the father of the Greeks. In India, he was known as the Lord of Creation. His name is Prajapati, and he's a god. He's supposedly the god that created the world. I don't know how Japheth got that reputation, but he at least started India, perhaps. And in ancient Rome, he was called Jupiter, the main deity of the Roman religion, the sky god or the god of lightning and thunder. And the Roman army, they carried around eagles on their banners as their symbol. That was the symbol of Jupiter, the powerful eagle who spread and conquered over the whole earth. That's where Roman eagles came from. And he was the equivalent of the Greek god Zeus. So Japheth got lots of attention in the ancient world, probably because he spread the furthest and made the most nations. Now, one ancient Jewish source says that Japheth's wife was named Adatenes. Not that that really matters, but it seems, though, that Japheth's kids named lands after themselves, but Japheth himself didn't name any nations after himself. Many of his kids were apparently sailors, because a lot of them built ships, became maritime peoples, and sailed all along the Mediterranean, settling on the coasts of Turkey, Greece, Italy, some of the islands like Cyprus, and France and Spain, and perhaps even around Spain to England. So as sailors, they were able to travel farther. Some of his children, though, stayed on land. They were not sailors. They moved north into Scandinavia. They formed at least Norway and Sweden, possibly Finland, Estonia, the Balkan states. So they went due north. And some of them went to Germany, France, and England. One branch went to Russia and Siberia. Another branch went into Persia and all the way to China. So a lot of the Chinese are probably from the line of Japheth. However, there are some Hamites there too, we'll talk about. Now, we don't know if the Genesis table of nations lists them in birth order or if there's some other order. We don't really know. So we don't know if Gomer was the firstborn, but Gomer is listed first. And I want you to turn over to Ezekiel 38, 1-6, because we're going to see a bunch of the names of Japheth's kids here. So Ezekiel 38, verses 1-6. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog, the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and lead you out with all your army, horses, horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with their shields and helmets. Gomer and all his troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops. Many people are with you. We don't really have time to understand what exactly that prophecy means, and I'm not entirely sure I do either. But it's obvious that Gog and Magog are descendants of Japheth, and at some point they become enemies of God's people. It's possible that this refers, in my opinion, to the Seleucids. If you remember Antiochus Epiphanes in the 3rd century, who invaded and took over Israel, but later was wiped out. Or it could be the Scythians. But what obviously happens here is some giant alliance of people from Africa and Europe are both involved in this prophecy, and God says he's going to destroy them or capture them all. Now, according to the book of Jubilees, Gomer was given the first portion, and that was the land of Greece, just west and north of Anatolia, or Turkey. So Gomer basically took over Greece, and his first major city was Galatia. And that's where Paul would later write his letter to the Galatians. So these are kids from Japheth. And it's interesting, too, that their name in Galatia, they were called Gauls. Not Galatians, they were called Gauls. But the word Gaul means milky skinned, meaning that they were pale white folks. So it appears that many of these Galatian Gauls, once they settled in Galatia, they continued to move west, and they became the Gauls who moved into France, who became longtime enemies of the Romans. You've heard of the Gauls. Julius Caesar fights them there. So Greece and France, and probably England, then moving over from France, probably came from Gomer, the first son of Japheth. Another son took over Turkey. That's Anatolia. Another son took northern Persia. Now his name was Madai, and that's what we call the land of the Medes. Remember the Medes and the Persians in the book of Daniel? The Medes are from northern Iran. That's from the sons of Madai. And later, his greatest descendant would be Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great is the one who sent the Jews home after their captivity in Babylon. The Medes then went southeast and settled in Pakistan and India and became probably the parents of the modern India people. Another son of Gomer moved into Persia and then moved east into China. So you can see that Japheth's kids are just going everywhere. Magog is the second listed of Japheth's sons. It appears that he founded the Scythians. They were ancient cavalry horsemen, excellent horsemen. And it appears that some of them moved east to become the Huns of Central Asia and the Mongols of Eastern Asia. So whenever you hear about the ancient cavalry armies, that's Magog. They apparently loved horses and liked to ride fast. These armies were never conquered by Rome because the Romans were almost entirely infantry, and an infantry army cannot conquer a horse army because the horse army can just ride away or ride around in circles. They're faster. And Magog also, some of his kids went north, forming Finland and Sweden and Estonia and the Baltic states. And another son of Gomer moved to Germany and formed the German barbaric states, as we call them, the barbarians. The fourth listed son of Japheth was Javan. Now, Javan settled in the islands. His most famous descendant would be Alexander the Great, 1,500 years later. They liked to live, they traveled in ships. They lived along Turkey, Greece, Italy, Spain, and the islands, always near water. One of Javan's sons, Tarshish. You've probably heard of the ships of Tarshish. That's because they built big ships and controlled the Mediterranean Sea and traded all over it. And later they would become the Empire of Carthage that the Romans opposed. And one son apparently settled in Portugal in Western Europe. The fifth son of Japheth was called Tubal. If you turn over to Isaiah 66, you'll see Tubal and Javan mentioned, and also Tarshish. It's Isaiah 66, 18 and 19. For I know their works and their thoughts. It shall be that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. I will set a sign among them, and those among them who escape I will send to the nations, to Tarshish and Pul and Lud, who draw the bow, and Tubal and Javan, to the coastlands far off, who have not heard my fame nor seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. I'm not sure exactly what this means, but it is possible that it's referring to the dispersion after Jesus, when the persecution of the Christians became so great that they traveled all, often like Paul, traveled by sea, and they ended up being dispersed all over the world and spreading the gospel. So it's possible that that's what this is talking about, the sons of Japheth moving all over the world and declaring my glory among the Gentiles. So Tubal lived in western Turkey and then moved to southern Spain and formed many of the Iberian tribes. And here's something interesting. One place that bears Tubal's name that you never noticed, and I never knew until this week. If you know the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, do you know what the capital of it is? Tbilisi. Tbilisi is a variant of Tubal. So Tubal apparently formed the ancient Republic of Georgia. Now, Japheth's sixth son is called Meshach, but he only appears a few times in the Bible. We won't read those because they're just a mention. They lived in Cappadocia, which is northeastern Turkey. But then they traveled to Russia, and guess who Meshach got named after? The capital of Russia is called Moscow, also called Muscovy, which is from Meshach. So the city of Moscow is named after one of Japheth's kids. These are also the ones who later moved to Siberia and then went across the land bridge near Alaska during the Ice Age to come down into North America. So we are probably descendants of Meshach, although, as I said, there's also the Ham tribe that came over. The last son of Japheth was named Tiras. And his name is probably the foundation of the people called the Thracians of southern Ukraine and north of Macedonia and Greece. They became the Dacians, the Romanians, the Serbians, and the Hungarians of northeastern Europe. One branch from Tyrus moved to Italy and became called the Etruscans, and later the Romans. So the sons of Japheth also produced ancient Rome. It's also probable that the god Thor from many ancient religions in Europe is named after Tyrus, because his original name was not Thor, it was Tur, and Tur for Tyrus. And his people were known to be very fierce warriors. And the famous movie recently called Troy, about the Battle of Troy, where Achilles and Hector fought, Troy was named after Tyrus. So lots of things for Tyrus. So what I'm saying here is that it's quite obvious about Japheth's line. Here's what is obvious. First of all, most of them were white-skinned. They spread over the earth, mostly in the north. They seem to like colder climates for the most part. They went from Turkey, they went west all the way through Europe. We went through all of Russia. They went up through Scandinavia, and then they went to India and China as well. So you could almost see them as an umbrella, popping up out of Turkey, going north, and then going west and east. They took over the whole northern of the world. And then they spread to the Americas. In contrast, we looked last week at Ham. Ham took Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, and eventually all of Africa. Now, next week we will talk about Shem, but he didn't go very far. In fact, he stayed put. He stayed mostly in Iraq, Babylon, and Saudi Arabia, but later he would conquer Canaan. So it was Japheth who was the expander, who expanded over most of the planet. Now, one difficulty with explaining the North American Native Americans and their arrival in the continent, one of the difficulties is that they did not develop written languages, or at least they didn't keep them if they had them before. They stayed entirely with oral transmission of information. And so many Native American stories have either become corrupted over the centuries or mythical over thousands of years. And it also means that their languages may have radically changed since they first came to the Americans. So in other words, it's hard to find comparisons from the Native Americans to where they came from. They don't have similar words at all. However, one interesting possibility is that one of the tribes of Ham did come. It appears that some descendants of Ham sailed to South America across the Atlantic Ocean, because in southeastern South America, the Olmecs, we find that their language is very similar to the West African languages, which could only happen probably if some people from West Africa sailed across, in which case that happened long before Christopher Columbus or the Vikings. But we also know that the children of Ham came to the Americas because of the genetics of Native Americans, who look a lot like the Siberians. The people of Siberians and the Eskimos and the Native Americans have facial and bodily features that are very similar. And that's a reason we believe that some of the children of Ham came. You see, one of the descendants of Ham was named Sineus, S-I-N-E-U-S. And Sineus lived in China. And in fact, one of their major tribes, you've heard of the Han dynasty, the Han dynasty? Han is for Ham. So they're from the Hamites. And the Han dynasty, some of those people moved up through Siberia and came across into the Americas, we believe. That's where we get the word, have you ever heard of Sino-American relations? Sino is from the Sinites. The Chinese called themselves Sinites for thousands of years. And a genetic DNA map on the website Answers in Genesis shows that 2 tribes of Japhethites and 2 tribes of Sinites from Ham both moved to North America. And if their genetic tests are correct, it looks like the Hamites moved to Western America and formed the Western tribes of the Native Americans, and the Japhethites went to the east side. And this may be one reason why there was always fighting between the Native Americans and the Indians, because they were from different families and hated each other and didn't share the same languages. So in the Eastern Native American languages, apparently a lot of those are similar, and the Westerns are similar, but they're not similar to each other. And then they also moved down through South America and formed Northern South America. Genetically, we also get some confusion about these migrations. We're talking about giant migrations of people all over the world. Now, Answers in Genesis, I read it just last night. They have a deep study of an archaeological site in England. And there are signs there that there were Middle Eastern and even Asian influences on the pottery found in England that's 2,400 years old. 2,400 BC, which would be just after the flood. Now, how is it that you get Asian or Middle Eastern pottery in England 2,400 years before Christ? Well, it makes perfect sense if the Tower of Babel story is true. Because if you lived in Babylon and you were building the tower and suddenly your languages changed and you all scatter over the earth, where is the pottery coming from? From the Middle East. So it's pretty obvious you're carrying Middle Eastern pottery with you. And if you married some of the other tribes people, the Asian influence would also be there. So it's kind of hard to understand, but I think that's how it happened. The people moved fast. It's almost like God lit a fire under them to make them move. God's whips were at their backs so that they went as far as they could, real fast. So also, as long as the children of Japheth were friendly to each other, they could have continued trade. So if all of these people are related to Japheth and they're still friendly, they could send stuff from China and India to Babylon, and from Babylon to Turkey, and from Turkey to England. It's called a trade route. So I suspect that that's why we see that kind of pottery in England. I would also mention that genetically, it is possible that the children of Japheth took wives from Ham or Shem, and thus they carried a mix of genes with them everywhere they went. So in other words, when the Tower of Babel happened, it's possible that some of the Japheth kids had married some of the Ham kids and married some of the Shem kids. And so when they moved to England, they still had that genetic, not abnormality, just that genetic area in them from another tribe. And so the fact is, there's this big popular thing now about doing DNA tests to see on your family. You can even do it on your pets now. But what it turns out is that all of us are just muds. None of us are just children of Japheth or children of Shem. We've got children of Ham and children of Shem in us, even if we are from the tribe of Japheth. We have quite a mix of genes. And that's actually good because it generally makes us healthier. If you were all inbred from the same tribe, you would have lots of similar deformities and blood problems. So what this proves also is that we're all humans, and that no racial tribal characteristic makes us not human. We can breed together, no matter what tribe you're from. And that's a strong sign of genetics and relationship. So now I want you to go back briefly to Genesis 9:27. And that's because when Noah cursed Canaan, he also blessed Shem and Japheth. So I want you to see the blessing. Genesis 9:27. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. So first of all, I want to point out the most important thing from this whole morning is that dad jokes are okay. No. Because God pulls a dad joke here through Noah. You see what Noah said? May God enlarge Japheth. Japheth's name means enlarge or expand. So may God expand the expander, is what God said through Noah. That's a dad joke for sure. And it says he will dwell in the tents of Shem. Now, we'll see this more next week, but Shem never moved around. He stayed in the same spot. So it seems, though, that Japheth's kids took over the territories on the north and the east sides of Shem. I told you that Japheth's sons took over Iran and the Medes and the Scythians. That covers all of the north of Iraq where Shem lived. And Japheth took over India and China. That's east of where Shem lived. So he covers him on two sides. Now, on his other two sides, Shem is surrounded by Ham, the Canaanites and the Syrians and the Egyptians, and some of the coasts of Saudi Arabia. So Shem is stuck between the two. So when it says that Japheth will live in the tents of Shem, it seems also in ancient history that the northern peoples and the eastern peoples never bothered the Iraqis much. They were all at peace. They were kind of like allies. Whereas Shem's always getting attacked and having trouble from the sons of Ham. So I think that's what God is getting at there in this this blessing from Noah, is that Japheth and Shem will still be friends and allies and brothers. Now, I'm not saying that I skipped a little paragraph here we need. Ham always loses in the battles in the ancient world, except for the several centuries when Egypt was the world power. And that was started by Joseph saving Egypt because he knew about the famine. Africa has often and almost always been conquered and colonized by other nations of the earth. Now, I'm not saying that the curse of Noah is a justification for oppression or for colonialism. And in fact, colonialism is probably an evil in itself. All of that is wrong in the New Testament scheme of things. But one general difference, why is it that Africa and the children of Ham have always been conquered? One difference I see right off the top of my head is a lack of unity. In order for a country or an empire to be powerful, it has to be unified. When it's not unified, it falls apart, just as Jesus said. When Egypt was powerful, it ruled North Africa and the Middle East. But ever since, it has been fragmented, and no one in Africa has been a strong power. Now, you could say maybe that's the fault of colonialism, that the British and the Portuguese and the Germans and whoever else owned pieces of Africa, they set up arbitrary borders and things like that. That may contribute to things. But a lot of it does come down to tribalism in Africa. And I'm not meaning that as a demeaning term. I'm not saying that the Africans are primitive. I mean tribalism in the same sense that we use the term balkanization. You heard of balkanization? It's a term that means the Soviet Empire ruled Eastern Europe for a long time. And they broke up all these countries. When the Soviet Union left, all these little countries broke up into tiny little places with no help. They don't help each other. They're in competition with each other. That's tribalism too, balkanization. And a lack of unity is always a sign of weakness. And I believe that's where the United States is now in its political realm. The careers of our oligarchic senators and congresspeople are now based on tribalism. You get elected by being rich and giving the locals whatever they want. This means you have to do gerrymandering. That's the intentional and ridiculous manipulation of census maps to get your voters so that you always get reelected. That means that our dying Republican system is no longer about the general good. We are all competing against each other. We see that we can be prosperous as long as we're better off than those other people in the next county over. This is all a sign of selfishness and greed, because our concept of capitalism no longer means working for your family and your community. It only means working for me. Selfishness always leads to disunity, and disunity always leads to collapse. Now, I certainly have strong political opinions. I try not to share them too often in sermons because it distracts from the gospel. But you probably also have strong opinions. But this growing talk we're seeing about civil war is very dangerous, because once you start talking about things, you start thinking about things and considering the possibility of things. Instead, we should be praying for more unity rather than less. And the church is a model of that. If the churches were more unified and we got along better with each other, we would be a model of the kind of unity we would like to see in our country. So that's one of the things we're trying to do, is become unified with a kind of a local group of churches. So that's all for today. I finished a little early. Do you have any questions or comments about the sons of Japheth?
I was just going to mention the wine thing that I guess you talked about it last week.
Mm-hmm.
So I've heard sermons where people say that wine in the Bible isn't really that alcoholic, and you can't really, that's why they say it's actually wrong for you to drink wine, because when it talks about wine in the Old Testament, drink a little bit of wine, it's talking about just grape juice, But here we see that Noah actually got drunk. I mean, not Noah. Noah got drunk from wine. So obviously it had alcohol in it.
Yeah, I talked about that. I was a member for 10 years or so of the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America. They're called the Covenanters. And their three distinctive principles are called wine, women, and song. They believe wine is evil, women cannot be leaders, and song can only be songs. And I didn't really have a problem with some of that, but the wine thing. Yeah, my New Testament Greek teacher taught us that Jesus turned the water into grape juice, because wine would be evil, and Jesus would never do that. So
We call it Kool-Aid.
Kool-Aid. Yeah. But yes, wine, it probably was less potent perhaps, but you could make it more potent. There were ways to do it. Noah could probably figure it out. He's a smart man. Yep.
Years ago, when Mike and I were going from the Bible church to the Reformed, I had an issue because they said that it was okay to drink alcohol, but mine was on a personal level, not a biblical level. And my son pointed out, he goes, Mom, it's not a sin to drink, it's a sin to get drunk.
Right.
And so I was like, wow, okay, that doesn't give you carte blanche to just get drunk all the time.
Right.
Because, it's like what God made for good, man has made for bad.
Mhm.
But anyway, that just made sense to me once,
Well, in Psalm 104 says that God makes the grapes to grow so that the heart of man may be merry. Yeah, so,
One more question, maybe this is for a different time, but it covers Magog in here. And you refer to obviously Ezekiel 38. Then the other well-known place
Revelation.
is Revelation 20. Yeah. So is there a time, is this referring to the same Gog and Magog in all three places, or is it different Gog and Magog?
Magog means the land of Gog. So Gog and Magog really go together. That's why they're always together. As to what it means in Revelation, that's an interesting question. Of course, the dispensationalists think that it means that after the millennium, the northern peoples will unite, and the Russians in particular are Magog, and the Russians will invade Israel from the north, and the pagans will invade from the south, and Jesus will defeat them all at Armageddon. That's the dispensational view. I haven't decided yet what that means in my eyes. I don't know. Not sure.
Isn't it funny back, even go back to Christ's final days, we were still looking for Christ to be the earthly ruling king.
Mhm.
That's what you're
Right.
explaining now, and so we're gonna look forward to an earthly ruling king.
Right. Yeah, I don't think that's ever going to happen until after the Judgment Day. I don't think he's going to be a political guy for 1,000 years. We'll talk about that more in the sermon, actually. Okay, well, I think it's already off. Oh, no. So we'll start up again in about 50 minutes, 45 minutes.